Hey gang, Scott here. We're moving forward with this mini-series on masking with the ON1 tools. We've reached luminosity masks, and this one tends to be a little confusing to folks. I'm hoping to demystify it for you so that you can put them to use in your photography. They are very, very useful masking tools. So we'll explain what a luminosity mask is, how to use it, how to control it, and an example or two of it in action. If you haven't seen some of the other videos in the series, go check those out. I've covered every other masking tool in the toolbar so far. So if you got masking questions, you're going to find the answers in those videos. So let's start with luminosity mask. What is a luminosity mask? Well, it's a mask that is automatically built for you by ON1 based on the luminance tones in your photo. All right, that sounds like a very technical description, so we're going to break it down. Luminosity mask. What does luminosity mean? The brightness or darkness of every pixel in your photo. It's a pixel by pixel measure. What's a mask? Well, we learned that earlier in the series, right? We can either conceal or reveal something. What do we know about masks? Black conceals, white reveals, and gray is somewhere in the middle. Well, luminance tones are the same thing, right? We have dark, deep shadows or pure black for, complete shadow. And we have very bright highlights, white on the histogram toward the far end there. Maybe you can see where this is going, where you're connecting the tones of your image to build a mask. And let me reiterate that, hopefully with this example here, just looking at this photo. We're not going to do any adjustments here, but we're going to explain the luminosity mask. So we look at this photo and we see all sorts of luminance tones, right? Up in the clouds where the sun's hitting that, there's some very, very bright tones, right? That's a very bright luminance. And then there's these these little trees and scrub down on the land, the silhouette of the telephone pole. That's all dark tones. So when these get translated into a luminosity mask, again, what is masks? It's black tones, white tones to conceal or reveal. Well, we add a luminosity mask. Let me just do this here. I'll grab a filter. I don't even care about the effect. Just put that at 0. What I care about is this button here, Lumen, and then I will view it. We're looking at the mask. This is not a black and white treatment of the photo. This is the mask right here, this mask that ON1 built. And what happened? Let me turn off the view. The brightest tones in the photo, like up in this cloud here, those got masked near white. Bright luminance, bright color in the mask. Conversely, the shadows, those deep shadows on those trees off on the hill, those got masked as very dark gray toward black. And so that is how a luminosity mask works. It's very easy to create it. You click a button and you get it. And the tones of the mask, the way the mask gets built, rather, is based on the tones of your image. And we can use that to our advantage when we're processing. If we have certain tonal ranges in our photo that we want to affect or protect, a luminosity mask is an elegant way to do that, and you don't have to do a lot of hand painting. Now, there are some controls for the luminosity mask. I'm going to shift to an image of a rough equivalent of the zone system to give you a better example of how these controls work and how you can target certain tonal regions of your photo with a luminosity mask. So let's get into that. If you know the zone system, you'll recognize this is rough. This is not exact representation, but for our purposes here, this will be fine. From left to right, we have pure black all the way over to pure white. So we have a nice, clean, smooth gradation, and we have every potential luminance tone represented here. And then along the bottom, we've got a rough approximation of the different zones. You don't have to understand the zone system to understand the controls of the luminosity mask, which is why I have this picture here on the screen, so we can see how the controls affect things, and you can target your shadows, your highlights, your midtones, and so forth. Now I need a filter. I need something, either a local or an effect that has a mask that we can manipulate. So bleach bypass, this is an interesting choice, but I want to take the amount to 0, so I'm doing nothing, right? There's nothing happening to the photo. Before and after, no change. I will now add in a tint, and a pretty strong one at that. So we have something visual. Okay, we can see that we're adding this orange tint, and it is touching very, very, very barely the deep shadows, and likewise barely the highlights, because you can't really tint pure black and pure white. It's, just those strong pures overpower the tint. Now we go into Luminosity Mask. We'll add a Luminosity Mask, and we're going to see some change. Well, what just happened? I'll view the mask. It's going to look very much like the image of this zone system we're working with, right? Because I started with a black and white image. A luminosity mask creates a mask that fundamentally is a black and white version. And the mask, looking at the swatch, looking at the mask, what do we know about masks? Black conceals, white reveals. So by default, we'll see less tint in the shadows and then gradually more tint because the mask is lighter and lighter. It's approaching from conceal on the left all the way to reveal on the right. I turn that off and we can see that effect, right? Reset the mask, add the luminosity mask. We can see that effect. And now we have this luminosity mask added. And so this is one easy use case. If you have an effect that you want to have very little impact to the shadows and most of the impact to the highlights, and you just want that nice and smooth across your entire photo, click the lumen button and you're done. If you want the reverse, click the lumen button, click invert, and you're done. Like if I click invert here, we'll see the reverse. Very little is being affected in the highlights and more of the tint is going toward the shadows. I'll view that mask. This is the inverted mask, right? So now we're concealing on the right in the highlights and revealing toward the shadows, right? Invert the mask, invert the mask. Let's look at it without the view. Targeting toward the highlights, inverted luminosity mask. Standard luminosity mask, right? Where the shadows get concealed, the highlights get revealed. So just with those couple of buttons, you've got quite a bit of control. But there's even more. We have some pretty fancy controls here. We have two of them, levels and window. And let me begin by explaining window. So if this is the full breadth of shadows to highlights, think of window as being able to narrow what you're affecting. And if I still have that full breadth, but I'm only using a portion, I can slide that window around to target certain areas. I find it best to work visually with these sliders. So let's go back to the photo here. So window, right now you can see we have two controls, one at the far left, one at the far right. This is shadows. So you can see even the slider, go from dark shadows all the way to bright highlights. And this is our highlights. If I tug in the window and say, you know what, I want this window to be tighter. I don't want things to be affected in the shadows. I'll start pushing it and watch the photo. You'll see that shadows, the tint is creeping away from the shadows, right? It's disappearing. So I'm saying the window, what's in between my 2 points, is only the upper half of the tones, right? If I keep going and keep going, I can really make this very, very narrow. Similarly, we can go in the opposite direction and say, I don't want those highlights. Protect those highlights. Pull this down. I can tighten it up and say, just really get in the middle, right? So you can see how those window points, as I make them more narrow, I'm only going to affect the tones that are in between these 2 points. And once again, the whole slider, pure black on the left, pure white on the right. And so this ended up on my rough estimation between zone 5 and 6. The zone part doesn't matter. Again, when you're working with a photo, and we'll do some examples of that, work visually. But you have these controls. Now let me broaden that window a little bit. Let me push maybe here. So we've got the shadows protected and we're affecting most things and then not the highlights. The second control we have is the levels. And you can think of the levels as kind of the transition between shadow and highlight. How aggressive do you want that transition to happen? Do you want to bias it toward highlights or toward shadows? And in fact, let's open the window up all the way and work levels independently. So we have three controls. We have the pure black point, we have a midpoint, and we have a highlights. Let's start working with the midpoint, okay? So if I push the midpoint toward shadows, notice that I'm getting more tint in the shadows. If I push it toward the highlights, I'm getting a whole lot less. So I'm already saying I want to consider, where do I have that bias point set to consider more things highlights or more things shadows. With the end points, let me double click levels. We can once again squeeze things in. So this is similar to window with a pivot point, and then the end point here is similar to window. In practice, in operation, I'll tend to use window first to kind of target in. Where do I really want my effect to be? And then levels to bias it. Do I consider things to be more shadows? So I'm going to add more into the shadow area. Am I going to take away? Am I going to squeeze this further? And you can see that band is getting tighter and tighter and tighter. Notice the transition. If I get these end points closer to that center point, the transition gets much tighter, right? You can make this pushed really, really tight and crunch all of that tint aggressively into an area. These are conceptually a little hard to deal with. And again, what I'll encourage you to do is work visually. We're using this contrived example of a few gray boxes on a screen so you can see how you're able to move around and target certain tonal areas of your photo, shadows, midtones, highlights. In practice, when you're working with a photo, you first think window. That's my recommended workflow. Work your window first and figure that I want to affect either the shadows or the highlights or something like that. Get your window dialed in, and then watch your photo as you're adjusting levels just to see what the look is. And actually, let's go through an example right now of one example of using a luminosity mask and how you can use it to target certain things, and using these window and levels controls, working visually while you're viewing the mask to figure out what is it that I'm really impacting and how does it really look on my image. Let's return to our sunrise photo here, and let's say the adjustment I want to make is the foreground is a little dull. I want that to be a little brighter and a little warmer. And sure, I have other masking tools that I could use to target the foreground, but the reason I like luminosity masks is because they are very gentle adjustments and gentle gradations. So I'll use a local adjustment for this. Add the adjustment, and like anything that has a mask, we have luminosity. So I'll click the luminosity mask. The photo just got a whole lot darker because the default is the darken style. But right now I'm interested in working the controls to fix my mask up here. So let me do view. And I am interested in targeting the foreground. And we look at our mask and we see, all right, the upper part of the photo is mostly highlights, right? The clouds are very bright white. It's a light gray tone. So my window, I want to reduce from the highlights side. I don't want to affect things. Now, as I start pulling the slider, we'll start to see deep black creep into the sky. Now, remember, we're working on the mask. We're basically painting out. We're saying paint away all that stuff. I don't want any of that stuff. It's starting to creep into the foreground, so I'll maybe stop right around there. And then I have levels. Do I need to do anything with levels? What happens with levels? And at this point, I'm just starting to work visually. It's like, oh, I don't want that. That's taking things away from my foreground. Or that's adding things in. That's good. And usually less is more here. And I'm not worried about the tiny bits up at the top or in the corners, or those power lines going through. Those power lines are very, very deep, dark blacks, the silhouette of the telephone pole. And again, I like the luminosity mask because I get this gentle gradation. I mean, the nuance in this foreground, I mean, look at that mask. In the grasses, there is some things that are brighter gray, some things that are charcoal, a couple of things that are really dark gray. And I might even adjust my feather, and I'll push it really far to see what happens, just to smooth out the edges there a little bit. Yeah, I've got a nice looking mask. Turn off the view. Now let's get into the adjustments I really want. Turn off exposure. Let's raise exposure up a little bit. I'll push it far. You can see it's only doing things on the foreground, but look how intelligent that is now. The darker bits in the grasses are staying darker. It's not like, it's not overexposing those. It's just a nice control that we have courtesy of the mask, and maybe add a little bit of warmth. Just a touch. Right? And now before and after. And if things feel off, things feel awkward, we can go back into the masks. We have those controls here. I can still work the levels. I can maybe increase that window and introduce some of that warmth back up into the sky. I mean, you can see it creeping in, right? This would be the entire scene getting that warmth and exposure. But again, at a very intricate level. There's more warmth being targeted to, say, the clouds and a lot less to the shadows because of that luminosity mask. Well, in my case, I really don't want that. I'll let that bleed back out. And I had that somewhere around here. Yeah, something like that. But this is how we can work with luminosity masks to do some very intricate adjustments, but with not very much heavy lifting. I'm not having to hand paint a lot of this stuff here. Actually, nothing at all so far, right? Let's try one other thing with this photo. Let's add a second adjustment, and I'm looking again at the foreground, but let's see about doing a little bit of a dodge and burn. Click here, get our lumen, view it, and these darker parts that are in the grasses there, can we target those? Now here's an example where we know we want to target the shadows. So we could start by, decreasing this and really getting down into those shadows. But, those shadows are never going to get to be pure white without some real pushing around on levels. And, that window needs to get really deep. That's getting pretty close, right? You're having to work pretty hard to get that stuff in there, but that's okay, right? You can push these sliders around as much as you need and maybe protect my super pure blacks, because what I want to make sure I don't have happen is those trees in the background. I don't want those to get this additional burning I'm about to do. So we'll do something like that, and then a little bit of feather around there. And then here, that's way too much exposure, but we could take that down just a touch, right? We're doing dodging and burning, but we're doing it, what I'm targeting here is all these little darker patches in the grasses before and after, right? These are subtle touches, but they are so meaningful to a landscape photo like this. And by virtue of working with these sliders, going to work visually, turn on that view, put it in grayscale mode, and don't be shy about pushing these sliders around relatively aggressively. I think my only advice is that with levels, when you get really tight, you'll have very, very crisp transitions. Remember, we saw that looking at the zone system with the bleach bypass example. So having some amount of gap on your levels gives you that smoother transition. Just work visually, and then the end result, and I'll take that exposure down a little more aggressively than I probably would for the photo, but just so you can see it, that's a little bit too much. But before and after, you can see what's getting targeted. It's those deeper shadows, but not quite pure black. Rein that back into something reasonable before and after. And that is a very nice way to add some depth into a photo, courtesy of classic dodge and burn, just done with a more modern tool like luminosity masks. I'll show you one more example of luminosity masks in action, because these adjustments have been predominantly tonal, exposure, a little bit of warmth, but you don't have to limit yourself to tonal adjustments. You can do anything you want with luminosity masks. They are just masks, so use them with any type of filter that you want. With this image here, I want to add some punch to the highlights, specifically the whitewash and this bright rock, which is the subject here of the photo. So my favorite tool for that, dynamic contrast, adding some punch here. And for video purposes, so you can see what happens, let me push this to surreal. Way too much right now, but you'll be able to see the impact of a luminosity mask. So just looking, eyeballing the photo, we have very deep shadows in the background. We have a few deep shadows in the foreground rock. A lot of brightness here, and the whitewash is really the star of the show, plus the speckles on the rock. Go to our masking area. Lumen mask. You can already see things got tempered down quite a bit. And then view. Now we're looking at the mask. Remember, not a black and white version of the photo, just the mask. We want to target the highlights. I'll start with the window slider, working visually. Say, all right, I want to take away the shadows, and you can see it start to creep in, right? Now, there's a lot of bright stuff in this photo. So maybe around here is starting to feel good. And now we'll say, let's start working with levels. Is this helping me or not? Yeah, it's taking away some things in the sky I don't care about. What's this start doing? That's tempering things down. That's actually goodness too. What about our end point here? That's further refining thing. Notice that the whitewash, like the center parts of the whitewash, like those ripples in between, those are getting more intense. And so that like right in I'm looking at the lower part around the foreground rock before I adjusted that level, and then after, like those streams that are right in the center of that curl of water. There's some it's getting brighter in the center and it's tapering off. That's going to translate to a stronger contrast effect when we turn off the mask. So let's do that and see how we did here. We'll say before, after. Notice that punch, but it's distributed through the photo, hitting those highlights. It's making that ocean water really pop. Now, would I keep the photo this way? I would use some additional tools to take away some of this mask in the midground and the background in practice, right? If I view that mask again, I want your eye to be drawn here, in the foreground. I don't want it out here. And so I have my other masking tools that I can paint out and remove segments of the background that I don't need. And I'll be doing a different video about working with multiple masking tools a little later in the series. But just know, once you're done with your luminosity mask, you can, of course, reach for your other masking tools to refine it, to remove things like you don't want the clouds in this photo, paint them away, that sort of stuff. And this is just a couple of examples of how you can use luminosity masks. One that I have shown in many videos in the past, and if you haven't seen this one, I have a series on all of the effects filters. The glow look, perfect for the luminosity mask. Add a glow, add a luminosity mask. It's a one-click thing. Why? It reduces the glow in the shadow areas and lets it come through in the brighter areas, because in nature, bright things glow and dark things don't. It's a great combination. Go check that video out if you haven't seen it. And that's going to wrap it up for the luminosity mask. I hope this kind of unraveled some of the mystery if you had some confusion about luminosity masks. So this helps you out. And look at ways to incorporate them into your photography. You will get some very nice, nuanced, subtle adjustments, but they can really make the difference for your photos. Any questions? Drop them below. And until next time, my name's Scott Davenport. Have fun.